The great hall of the Valory Imperial Palace was full of people who knew how to smile without meaning it. Princess Sarah stood in the center of the hall with her hands folded in front of her and her silver eyes fixed on a point just above the floor. She was wearing the gold ceremonial dress that her handmaids had spent 2 hours putting on her. Her dark hair had been braided and pinned up with small jeweled clips. Around her neck sat a thin chain of pale blue stones that meant in Valory tradition that she was being offered in marriage. The court watched her with quiet amusement. She could feel it. She had always been good at feeling the temperature of a room, even when she kept her face still and gave nothing away. She felt the small, careful smiles passing between the noble families along the walls. She felt the way the whispers moved through the crowd like water finding low ground. She had grown up in this palace. She knew exactly what this gathering was. It was a joke and she was the part that made it funny. Sarah was 24 years old. She was the 3rd daughter of the 2nd prince of the Valory Empire, which placed her exactly far enough from the throne to be useful as a political tool, but not important enough for anyone to worry much about how she was used. She had been educated well, trained in diplomacy and court etiquette, given languages and art and history. She was intelligent and perceptive and composed under pressure. None of that mattered to the court. What mattered was that she could not have children. Every healer who had ever examined her had said the same thing in the same careful, apologetic tone. Her body simply would not carry life. In the Valory Empire, where bloodlines were everything and a noblewoman's primary value was measured in the children she could produce for an alliance, this made Sarah something the court did not know what to do with. She was not disgraced exactly. She had done nothing wrong, but she was useless for the one thing that mattered most. And useless things in polished places eventually get put somewhere out of the way. Her uncle, High Counselor Davin, had found the solution. He had arranged a match for her with a human. When the announcement was made 2 weeks ago, the court had laughed. Not openly, not in a way that anyone could point to as rude. It was the kind of laughter that lived in exchanged glances and pressed lips, and the slight shake of a wine glass, held just a little too tightly from the effort of containing amusement. Humans were new to the galactic community. They had made first contact barely a century ago and were still regarded by most of the older civilizations as interesting but minor. They were short-lived and physically soft and had not yet done anything significant enough to earn real respect. Sending an infertile Valory princess to live among them was not considered real marriage alliance. It was considered a polite way of removing a problem. Sarah had been informed of the arrangement 4 days before her departure. She had sat across the long dining table from her uncle and asked him in a very quiet voice if he understood what he was doing to her. Davin had smiled the way he always smiled, with all the warmth of polished stone, and told her that he was simply ensuring her future was secured. She had not argued. There was no point in arguing with a decision that had already been made by people who did not consider her feelings part of the calculation. She had gone to her rooms that night and begun to pack her belongings, and she had done it slowly and carefully and with great attention to detail, because it gave her hands something to do while She processed the fact that her family had just thrown her away. Her handmaid Vesa helped her pack. Vesa was not much older than Sarah and had been with her since they were both young. She folded clothes in silence for a long time and then said very quietly that she was sorry. Sarah told her not to be. She said she would be fine. She was not sure she believed it yet, but she said it anyway. The journey to the human planet called Earth took 11 days on the diplomatic transport. Sarah spent most of the journey in her small cabin, reading and watching the stars move past the window and thinking about what she knew of humans. It was not a great deal. She had read the standard briefings given to Valori diplomats, which described humans as emotionally driven, highly adaptable, and prone to forming deep attachments to things and people around them. The briefing said this in a tone that suggested these were interesting flaws rather than strengths. Sarah was not sure she agreed with that framing. She thought about the fact that she was going to meet a man she had never seen and live in a place she had never been and build some version of a life in a culture she barely understood, all because her own people had decided she was not worth keeping. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears in the Valori court became weapons in other people's hands, and the habit of keeping them private was too deep to break now. Even in the quiet of her cabin, she simply sat with the feeling and let it move through her, and then she picked up her book again and kept reading. The ship landed in a flat open space outside a small city in a region called Montana. The air that came through the open hatch was cold and sharp and smelled of pine, trees and earth and something clean that she had no Valori word for. The sky was a deep pale blue with white clouds that moved fast in the wind. Everything felt very large and very open. After 11 days in the ship, there was a vehicle waiting on the landing pad. There was a man standing beside it. Sarah walked down the ramp and looked at him. Cole Hartley was taller than she had expected. He had broad shoulders and a face that was weathered from time spent outdoors and steady brown eyes that were watching her come down the ramp with an expression she could not immediately place. He was not smiling in the polished, careful way of court people. He was simply watching her with calm, open attention, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. When she reached the bottom of the ramp, he stepped forward. He said in careful and slightly imperfect Valori, "Welcome, Princess. I hope your journey was not too difficult." Sarah stopped walking. She stood there in the cold Montana wind and looked at this man who had clearly spent weeks learning words in her language so that she would not arrive in a strange place without hearing something familiar, and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. "You practiced," she said. "For about a month," he admitted. "I am probably going to make a lot of mistakes." "You still did it," she said. "That was kind." He looked slightly uncertain about what to do with being called kind, which she found unexpectedly charming. He nodded once and then reached past her and picked up the largest of her bags before she could reach for it and carried it to the vehicle without making a performance of the gesture. Sarah watched him and then followed. The court in the great hall had laughed when they sent her here. She had stood in her gold dress and her blue stones and let them, but standing now on this cold landing pad with the mountains visible in every direction, and a man who had learned her language just to make her feel less alone. She thought that the people who had laughed perhaps did not know everything about how this story was going to end. Cole Hartley's house sat at the end of a long gravel road with pine trees on both sides and mountains filling the sky at the end of it like the window of the vehicle as they drove up the road, and felt something she was not prepared for. She had expected something bare and practical. She had expected the dwelling of a person who had agreed to this arrangement for reasons she did not yet understand. Probably political ones, probably ones that benefited him in ways that had nothing to do with her as a person. She had expected to feel the familiar distance of being somewhere she was tolerated rather than wanted. The house was low and wide with a covered porch running across the front of it. There were pots on the porch with plants in them that were brown and dried from the autumn cold, but had clearly been tended with care. There was a stack of cut wood against one wall neatly arranged. The windows were lit with warm light from inside. It looked like a place where someone actually lived, not a place arranged to make an impression. Cole stopped the vehicle and carried her bags inside without a lot of ceremony. He showed her the house with the same calm, practical manner he had shown at the landing pad, the kitchen, the sitting room with its bookshelves that were genuinely full and showed signs of heavy use, the bathroom, the guest room at the end of the hall with a window that looked out over the valley below. "This room is yours," he said. "Take whatever time you need to settle. There is no schedule tonight." Then he left her alone. Sarah stood in the middle of the guest room for a while. The bed had a thick quilt on it in shades of blue and green. Their small lamp on the table beside it. The window showed a sky that was turning orange and purple as the sun went down behind the mountains. She pressed her hand flat against the cool glass and watched the colors change and breathed slowly, and told herself for the third time that day that she was going to be fine. She believed it a little more than she had on the ship. Cole knocked on the door an hour later to tell her dinner was ready. He had made a meal of things that were warm and simple, and she noticed when she sat down and looked at her plate that he had avoided several of the items she had listed in the pre-arrival documents as incompatible with the Valori digestion. She had filled out those documents, expecting no one to read them carefully. Most officials skimmed them and served whatever was convenient. He had read every line. "You adjusted the meal," she said. "I did not want you to be uncomfortable," he said in the same straightforward way. He seemed to say everything without hedging or performing. They ate mostly without talking. Sarah had expected this to feel awkward. It did not feel awkward. It felt like two people who were both comfortable with their own silence sitting together in it. She had spent most of her life in a court where silence was treated with suspicion, and every moment of quiet was immediately filled with conversation designed to gain advantage or demonstrate status. This was different. This was just two people eating dinner. She found herself relaxing in small ways she had not noticed she needed to. Over the days that followed, she learned the shape of his life. Cole woke early and spent the mornings working outside, walking the land, or doing physical work that she did not always have names for. He had a large property, and he knew Every part of it the way people know. Places they have loved for a long time. He came inside for lunch and worked in the afternoon on the consultation work he did for a regional conservation group, sitting at his desk with reports and maps spread out around him. He cooked dinner in the evenings with a focused, unhurried attention that she found oddly peaceful to watch. He read constantly. The bookshelves in the sitting room covered 3 walls and had books stacked horizontally on top of the upright ones because there was not enough room. When she ran her eyes along the shelves, she found history and science and fiction and field guides and collections of old maps. She pulled one of the history books out one evening and started reading it and left it on the arm of the chair when she went to bed and found it the next morning with a small paper note tucked into her page that said only Chapter 4 is the best one. She read Chapter 4. He was right. She started leaving notes in the margins of the book she read and found his responses written beside them a few days later. It became a quiet, ongoing conversation that happened entirely in ink, and she liked it more than she had expected to. One afternoon about 3 weeks in, she went looking for him and found him sitting on the porch steps watching the valley. She sat down beside him without asking if it was all right, and he moved over slightly to give her more room on that step without making a thing of it. They sat there for a while. A bird made a sound somewhere in the trees that she did not know the name of. The wind moved through the dry grass on the hillside. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way she was learning meant he was thinking about how to say something honestly rather than easily. "My government came to me," he said. "They said there was a Valori princess who needed somewhere to go and asked if I would be willing. They told me she had been treated badly by her own court and deserved better than what she was being offered." He paused. "I said yes because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I was curious. Curious about me. About all of it," he said. "I had never met anyone from another world." Sarah looked at the valley below them. The light was going golden in the late afternoon. "They sent me here because they thought I was useless," she said. "I cannot have children. In my culture that means I am not worth a real alliance. They sent me to you because you were not a real option in their eyes, and I was not a real loss." She had not planned to say it so plainly, but something about the way he listened, with his full attention and without the particular quality of a person preparing their response while you were still talking, made plain words feel possible. Cole was quiet for a few seconds. "That is a cruel thing to do to someone," he said. "Not poor you, not what a terrible situation. Just a clean, direct statement that what had been done was wrong, offered without pity and without softening it into something easier to hear." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. "Yes," she said, "it was." The sun kept going down. The bird made its sound again. Neither of them moved to go inside, and neither of them needed to fill the quiet with anything else. They just sat there on the porch steps together until the sky turned dark and the first stars appeared, and Sarah thought that this was in its quiet and ordinary way one of the better evenings she had spent in a very long time. That night she wrote a message to Vesa. It said only, "He is not what I expected. He is much better." Vesa wrote back within the hour. It said, "Be careful, Sarah. Do not let yourself want something you cannot keep." Sarah read the message twice and then set her calm device down and lay back and looked at the ceiling of her small room with its quilt and its view of the stars. She thought about what she was allowed to want. She thought about how long she had not let herself want much of anything, because wanting things in the Valori court was the fastest way to give someone else a way to hurt you. And she thought about a man on a porch step who called cruelty by its name without softening it, and she thought that perhaps what she was allowed to want was a different question than what she had always believed it was. The second month passed the way good things often pass, quietly and without fanfare, each day folding into the next so naturally that Sarah barely noticed the weeks going by. She stopped sleeping in the guest room sometime near the end of it. She could not have named the exact night. It changed. There had been no single conversation where they decided anything. It had happened the way water moves, finding the natural path without being directed, one small moment at a time, until the distance between them was simply gone. She had not expected this. She had arrived in Montana prepared to endure, not to belong. She had packed her careful face along with her clothes and her books and had planned to wear it for however long this arrangement lasted. She had not planned for the arrangement to become something else entirely. She had not planned for Cole Hartley. But here they were. She knew the rhythm of his breathing. When he slept, she knew that he made coffee before he was fully awake and drank the first cup standing at the kitchen window looking out at the mountains. She knew that he got very still and focused when he was working through a problem, and that this was not unfriendliness but concentration. She knew that he laughed rarely but genuinely, a low surprised sound, like he was always a little caught off guard by the things that struck him as funny. He knew her too. He knew she read better in the mornings and thought better in the evenings. He knew that she found the noise of the wind at night comforting rather than alarming, unlike most of the indoor sounds this house made, which were still new to her. He knew that when she went quiet in a particular way, it meant she was dealing with something from home, and that the best thing to do was be nearby without demanding her attention. They had built something. She was not sure she had a word for exactly what it was, but she knew the shape of it and the weight of it, and she knew that it was real. The third month began well, and then in the first week of the fourth month, Sarah woke before sunrise with a feeling she did not know how to describe. Not pain, not illness, something else. Change in herself that she felt from the inside, quiet and undeniable, like a note being held in a room after the instrument had stopped playing. She lay still for a while and tried to understand it. Then she got up and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at her own reflection for a long time. Her face looked the same, her eyes looked the same, but the feeling did not go away. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this for 3 days in a row, while the feeling stayed exactly where it was, steady and patient, waiting for her to stop telling herself it was nothing. On the fourth day she asked Cole if there was a doctor in the area she could see without it becoming a public event. He did not ask why. He said yes, and the next morning he drove her to a small medical office in town that smelled of antiseptic and paper and something warm from a coffee machine in the corner. The doctor was a woman named Pat Ellison. She was older with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the manner of a person who had spent many decades seeing difficult things and had made her peace with being surprised. She sat across from Sarah and asked careful questions and listened to the answers with complete attention. Then she ran tests, several of them. She came back into the examination room and set her tablet down on the counter and pulled her glasses down from her forehead and looked at Sarah with an expression that was professionally steady but held just underneath the surface a quality of careful wonder. Before I tell you what I found, she said, I want to ask you something. You were told by your own physicians that you were unable to carry a child. Is that correct? Yes, Sarah said. By multiple physicians over many years. It was considered definitive. Using your own medical technology and standards. Yes. Pat Ellison was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think it is possible that human and Valorian biology interact in ways that neither of your people's science has fully mapped yet. You are pregnant, princess. The room went very quiet. Sarah sat with the words and felt them land one at a time. Pregnant she was. Pregnant, the thing she had been told for her entire adult life was not possible for her body. Had happened anyway in a small house in Montana with a man who made coffee before he was awake and left notes in the margins of books. Run the test again, she said. Pat ran it again. Same result. Again, Sarah said. Same result. Pat Ellison looked at her with quiet steadiness and said, I can run it as many times as you need. The answer will not change. Sarah sat there in the examination room for a long time after that. She heard from somewhere down the hall the faint sound of Cole in the waiting room, the turn of a magazine page. She thought about the healer who had told her when she was 16 that she would never carry a child and that she should make her peace with this. She thought about the way the Valorian court had looked at her after that. She thought about her uncle's smile across the long table and the soft laughter in the great hall and the gold dress and the blue stones. She thought about how none of them had considered the possibility that they might be wrong. She walked out to the waiting room. Cole looked up from the magazine and read her face in a single second the way he had gotten very good at doing. He put the magazine down and stood up. She said, I need to tell you something. And I need you to just listen first. Okay, he said. She told him. She stood in the waiting room of a small medical office with a coffee machine in the corner and told Cole Hartley that she was carrying a child that every doctor in the Valorian Empire had assured her she could never carry. She watched his face while she talked. She saw the still careful quality of it shift into something open and unguarded, the way it looked in early mornings before he had fully put himself together for the day. When she finished talking, the room was quiet. He did not say, Are you sure? He did not say, What does this mean? He did not do any of the practical or frightened things a person could do when receiving news this large. He reached out and took her hand and said, Are you all right? That was all, just that. Are you all right? Sarah looked at him. She felt something in her that had been held tightly for a very long time begin very slowly to loosen. I do not know yet, she said honestly. That is fair, he said. We will figure out the rest together. She looked down at their joint hands. His were large and brown from working Outside, hers were long-fingered and pale. They did not look like hands that belonged to people from the same world, because they were not, and yet they fit together in a way that she found she had no good scientific or political explanation for. They simply fit. Yes, she said quietly, we will. They drove home in the pale morning light with the mountains on both sides of the road. Cole kept one hand on the wheel and one hand holding hers the entire way. He did not try to fill the drive with words. He knew she needed to think. He always knew. Sarah watched the landscape move past the window and thought about the fact that her body had done something impossible. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what it would mean to the Valorian court, to the medical establishment that had defined her entire life by a limitation that had turned out not to be permanent, to her uncle who had sent her here as a joke. She did not feel triumphant. That would come later. Right now she just felt the warm weight of Cole's hand over hers, and the impossible, stubborn, quietly miraculous fact of the life growing inside her. And she thought that some things were simply bigger than the plans other people made for you. Sarah waited 3 weeks before she sent word home. She spent those 3 weeks in the house, with the mountains in the windows and the bookshelves full of used books and the smell of coffee in the mornings. And she let the reality of what was happening settle into her properly before she let the outside world know. She had spent her whole life having things announced before she was ready, decisions made about her in rooms she was not in, her circumstances delivered to her as facts she was expected to absorb without complaint. She was not going to give anyone that power over this. When she was ready, she did not write to her uncle. She did not write to the High Council or to the court officials who managed diplomatic communications, or to any of the people who had stood in the great hall and smiled their soft, careful smiles. She wrote directly to the Empress. The Empress was her grandmother's older sister, a woman in her late 90s who had ruled with the kind of absolute authority that came from spending a very long time being the most capable person in any room she entered. Most of the court was afraid of her in the way that people are afraid of things that are genuinely powerful rather than just positioned to appear powerful. Sarah was not afraid of her. The Empress was one of the very few people in the Valorian Empire who had ever spoken to Sarah as though she were a full person, rather than a political piece on a board. The message Sarah sent was short. It said, I am well. I am carrying a child. I expect that this information will require several assumptions about my situation to be reconsidered. I will return when I am ready. I will bring my husband. She sent it on a Tuesday morning while Cole was outside with his coffee, watching the sun come up behind the eastern ridge. She sat at the desk in the sitting room and read the message once more after she sent it, and felt a quiet, steady satisfaction that was not quite the same as happiness but lived close to it, the satisfaction of having said a true thing clearly to people who had not wanted it to be true. The Empress's response arrived in less than an hour. For a woman who controlled her communications with the precision of someone who had been in power for 6 decades, a response in under an hour meant the message had been read immediately and that the Empress had decided this was worth moving quickly. The message said, come home when you are ready. Bring your husband. There is a great deal to discuss. And then at the very end in smaller text. That was not part of the official response format. I am glad you are well, Sarah. I always hoped this would turn out better than Davian intended. Sarah read that last line several times. She had not known the Empress had reservations about what her uncle had arranged. She had assumed the whole court was aligned, the discovery that at least one person in that palace had been quietly hoping for her was small, but it landed somewhere tender and she let herself feel it for a moment before she put it away. She went outside to find Cole. He was standing at the edge of the property, where the land started to slope downward into the valley, holding his coffee with both hands and watching a hawk turn slow circles in the morning air above the ridge. He heard her boots on the grass and glanced over. The Empress wants to meet you, Sarah said. Cole watched the hawk for another moment. The Empress, he said. She is the most powerful individual in the known Valorian Empire, Sarah said. She rules 12 systems and has done so for over 60 years, and most members of the High Council are afraid to make direct eye contact with her. Cole turned to look at her. And we are going to visit her, yes. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking. Then he said, should I be concerned? She is also the only member of my family who sent me a private message when I arrived here asking if I was being treated well, Sarah said. And she just told me in writing that she hoped my situation would turn out better than my uncle intended. Cole looked back out at the valley. I already like her. Do not say that to her face. Immediately, Sarah said. Noted, he said. I will wait at least 10 minutes. Sarah looked at him sideways. He was still watching the hawk with that calm, unhurried attention he brought to most things. She thought about what the next weeks were going to hold, the return trip, the court, the political conversations that would need to happen, the legal questions around the child who would be the first Valori human individual ever recorded, which meant that every inheritance law and citizenship protocol and noble family rights document in the Empire was going to need to be examined in a new light. It was going to be complicated and loud and relentless. Cole was going to walk into the middle of all of it, having grown up on a farm in Montana. She needed to prepare him. She spent the following weeks doing exactly that. She taught him the forms of address for members of the imperial family. She explained the etiquette of the formal court, the rules around who spoke first and who was permitted to be seated, and what gestures meant respect and what the same gestures meant when directed at the wrong person. She explained the structure of the High Council and which members were likely to be hostile and why, and what their hostility would probably look like, because Valori noble hostility almost never looked like anything obvious. Cole listened to all of it with focused, serious attention. He asked good questions. He did not complain that it was complicated or overwhelming. He treated learning the Valori court the same way he treated everything else that needed to be understood, as a problem worth taking seriously and working through carefully. At night when she could not sleep, she sometimes lay awake and thought about the people back home who had arranged this match as a joke. She thought about what they had believed when they sent her here, that she would disappear quietly into an unremarkable life on an unremarkable planet, and the court would go on exactly as it always had. She thought about how certain they had been that nothing significant would come of it. It was a particular kind of foolishness, she thought, the kind that comes from believing you understand the limits of a situation that you have not actually examined carefully. She had been their overlooked piece, their unimportant variable, the inconvenient person they had found a lightweight to discard, and somewhere in the gap between what they expected and what they had not bothered to consider, something extraordinary had quietly grown. Vesa called one evening while Cole was at his desk finishing a report. Sarah took the call in the kitchen. She had not told Vesa yet. She had kept it close, wanting the news to be fully hers for a little while before she shared it. She told her now. There was a long silence on the line. Sarah, Vesa finally said, her voice was doing several things at once. I know, Sarah said. You are actually, yes. Another silence, then Vesa made a sound that was half laugh and half something. That was not a laugh at all. The court, Vesa said, is going to absolutely fall apart. Yes, Sarah said, it is. Your uncle is going to have a genuinely terrible month. At minimum, Sarah said. And the medical council who told you? All of them, Sarah said, yes. Vesa was quiet for one more moment. Then she said with a warmth that cut right through the distance between the stars, I am so glad, Sarah, I am so glad. I can hear it in your voice. You sound like yourself. You sound like the person you were before they made you learn how not to be. Sarah stood in the kitchen with Cole's coffee mug on the counter beside her and the mountain's dark shapes in the window glass, and felt something in her throat that she swallowed carefully. He is a good person, Vesa, she said. I did not know what that felt like from the inside. I think I had forgotten. Hold on to it, Vesa said. Hold on to both of them. Sarah looked through the doorway too, where Cole sat at his desk bent over his work entirely himself in the easy way of people who have never needed to perform. They returned to Vallori in the 7th month when travel was still manageable, and the pregnancy was visible to anyone who looked. Sarah had chosen the timing deliberately. She could have gone back earlier, could have made the journey when there was still room for doubt or ambiguity. She chose not to. She wanted there to be no question about what was happening when she walked back into that palace. She wanted the fact of it to be undeniable, immediate, and impossible to minimize. Cole prepared for the trip the same way. He prepared for everything, quietly and thoroughly and without making a production of it. He reviewed the notes she had given him about court etiquette. He practiced the formal forms of address until he had them correct. He asked careful questions about the specific people they were likely to encounter and what to expect from each of them. He was not fearless about it. She could see in small ways that he understood the weight of what they were walking into, but he was not letting the weight stop him from moving forward, which was, she had come to understand, simply how Cole Hartley operated in the world. On the morning of their departure, he stood at the bottom of the ramp to the transport ship and looked up at it for a moment, just a moment, the look of a man taking a breath before a hard thing. Then he picked up his bag and walked up the ramp without hesitation. Sarah walked up beside him and thought that she had known brave people in her life, soldiers and politicians and diplomats who had faced difficult things, but that this quiet, practical, unhesitating courage was the kind she respected most. The imperial palace was exactly as she had left it. The high white walls and the long corridors and the formal gardens and the smell of incense that lived in the old stone. Walking back through the entrance hall felt strange and familiar at the same time. The way revisiting a place from your past always feels. She had grown up here, she was returning, now as a different version of herself too. A place that had not changed but would have to. The Empress received them privately, before anything formal happened. Her rooms were at the top of the north tower, large and quiet with windows that looked out over the city below. She was sitting when they entered, a small woman who nonetheless managed to fill the room simply by being in it, the way very old trees fill a forest. She looked at Cole the moment he came through the door and did not look away, while they crossed the room and stood before her. Cole met her eyes. He gave the formal Valori greeting with correct pronunciation and only a slight accent. Then he waited. The Empress looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. You learned our language for her, she said. I started before I knew what she was like, Cole said. I just wanted her to hear something familiar when she landed somewhere new. The Empress turned to look at Sarah. Sarah looked back at her and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The Empress made a small sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, he will do. And the matter of Cole Hartley's place in the Valori imperial family was settled, at least in the room that mattered most. The formal session of court was something else entirely. The great hall was full. Every noble family, every council member, every diplomat and official who could justify being present had found a reason to be there. The news had spread. Everyone in that hall knew what the gathering was about. Sarah felt them watching as she and Cole entered, felt the quality of the attention shift in the room the way it had a year ago, but changed now, different in texture. Last time they had watched her with amusement. This time they watched with something more complicated. She kept her spine straight and her head up and walked to the front of the hall, with Cole beside her, and thought about the gold dress and the blue stones and the soft laughter in her uncle's polished smile. And she kept all of it exactly where it was, close enough to remember, far enough not to let it reach her face. The session was long. Legal voices were raised. 3 different inheritance scholars argued over clauses in documents that had not needed to be reconsidered in living memory. Medical council representatives were called forward and asked to address their previous conclusions, and did so with great care and very little eye contact. Several of the noble families lodged formal concerns about precedent, which was their right, and the Empress's legal staff began the process of responding to those concerns, which was going to take months. Through all of it, Cole sat beside her and did not fidget and did not show stress and did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him be anything less than completely composed. When he was spoken to directly, he answered clearly and correctly. When he was not spoken to, he sat with his hands calm on the table and his attention moving steadily around the room, reading it, understanding it, missing nothing. Sarah had never been more glad of another person's presence in her life. Her uncle was seated at the far end of the council table. He had said almost nothing since they arrived, which was unlike him. His face was carefully neutral in the practiced way of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. But Sarah had grown up watching him, and she knew the particular stillness of a person who had expected to be comfortable and found instead that the floor had moved. He was not the point. The child was born 4 weeks after they arrived in a room that had been used for royal births for 3 centuries. She came into the world on a quiet evening when the light outside the windows was going soft and gold. She was small, and her eyes, when she opened them, were the pale silver of Sarah's people. But she had Cole's hands, the broad, capable shape of them, even tiny as they were, and she had a quality about her, even in those first minutes, of a person who had arrived with something to say. The healer placed her in Cole's arms. First, Sarah watched his face. She had watched Cole Hartley's face through a great many things in the past year. She had watched him be patient and steady and kind and honest. She had watched him learn her language and sit through sessions of an alien court and carry her bags off a ship on a cold landing pad without making a performance of any of it. She had watched him be brave in the quiet way that she found braver than all the loud kinds. None of it had unmade her quite the way this did. He held the baby with careful, certain hands, the way he held things he valued, and looked at her face with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Nothing measured or careful, just open, full, completely present. "Hello," he said softly to his daughter. "We have been waiting for you." Sarah pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let the tears come, which she had not done in front of another person in longer than she could remember. Vesa, standing at the edge of the room, was crying openly and not bothering to hide it. The Empress had sent a message to the room that afternoon before the birth. It said, "Whatever she is called, let her name be given by her parents and no one else. I will make it official from there." They named her Neva. It was not a Valori name, and it was not a human name. It was a name they had talked about in the evenings in the house in Montana, sitting on the porch, with the mountains going dark and the stars coming out. One of those conversations that happens without anyone deciding to have it. Just two people thinking out loud in a place where that felt safe. Vesa told Sarah later in the weeks after the birth, when the political noise was still loud and relentless and showed no sign of stopping, that the story was already spreading beyond the court, that people in the empire were telling it to each other, the story of the infertile princess sent away as a joke, who came back with a husband and a miracle and stood in the great hall and said nothing because she did not need to. Sarah thought about this one evening, while she was sitting in the window seat of their rooms in the palace, holding Neva against her chest in the particular drowsy quiet of a sleeping infant, while Cole sat beside her with her feet in his lap and the mountains of the imperial city visible through the glass. She thought about her uncle's smile. She thought about the laughter in the great hall. She thought about the cold landing pad and the man who had learned her language for a month because he wanted her to feel less alone in a strange place. She thought about how the people who had planned her diminishment had not considered a single one of the variables that actually mattered. They had looked at her limitations and seen an ending. They had not asked what might be possible beyond what their own assumptions could reach. She looked down at her daughter's face, and then across at Cole, who was reading with one hand and holding her feet with the other in the easy way of a man, entirely at home wherever he happened to be. Some jokes, she thought, have very poor endings for the people who tell them, and some things that are sent away to disappear come back as something no one saw coming, rooted and real and impossible to dismiss, carrying the quiet, enormous weight of everything that grows when no one is watching. She held her daughter close and let the night come in through the windows, and she was in the deepest and most unguarded way happy.